The English Military Revolution. The Rise of the Longbowman. An armored knight has just spent a fortune on his equipment. A steel helm, a breastplate forged by a master smith, a warhorse bred for generations to carry that weight into battle. He is, by every measure his world understands, invincible. He is nobility. He is the apex predator of the medieval battlefield. He's about to be killed by a farmer. Not a farmer with a sword, not a farmer on a horse, a farmer standing in the mud, 300 yards away, holding a stick of yew wood strung with hemp cord. A weapon so simple a child could understand how it works, and so brutal it will humble the greatest army in Europe not once, but 3 times in a single century. This is the story of how England's peasants, using a weapon banned by the church for its savagery, tore apart the age of chivalry, and how a piece of bent wood became more feared than a knight's sword. This is the rise of the Longbowman, a world built on horseback. To understand how radical the longbow was, you have to understand the world it broke. For nearly 1,000 years, European warfare had one accepted truth. The knight rules the battlefield. Heavily armored, mounted on a trained warhorse, wielding lance and sword, the knight was the product of a lifetime of training and a fortune in equipment. Wars were fought and won by these mounted elites smashing through infantry lines. And infantry, poorly armed peasants and levies, existed mostly to be smashed. Common soldiers were not meant to kill nobles. That was not how the system worked. Ransom, not slaughter, was the polite business of medieval war between the upper classes. A captured lord was worth a fortune. A dead one was worth nothing. And worse, it broke an unspoken code that kept the aristocracy of Europe from wiping each other out entirely. The longbow did not care about any of that. A skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows a minute, each one capable, at close range, of punching through plate armor, and at longer range, cutting down horses, squires, and men-at-arms indiscriminately. A commoner with a bow could kill a duke from 3 football fields away and never see his face. This was not just a battlefield problem. It was a social earthquake.
Born in Wales, forged in England. The longbow itself wasn't an English invention. Its origins trace back to Wales, where hardy hill fighters had used tall, powerful bows for generations, weapons capable of punching through mail and wood alike. English chroniclers wrote, with a mixture of horror and admiration, about Welsh arrows that pierced oak doors, chainmail, and in one infamous account, a soldier's thigh, his saddle, and his horse in a single shot. England learned this lesson the hard way, through brutal campaigns against Welsh rebels in the 1200s. And England, ever pragmatic in matters of conquest, did what conquerors have always done with a superior enemy technology. It stole it. Edward I began recruiting Welsh archers directly into English armies. Over the following decades, the English crown didn't just adopt the longbow, it institutionalized it. And this is where the story becomes less about a weapon and more about an entire society reshaping itself around one.
A nation of archers. Here is where the longbow reveals itself as more than military hardware. It required something no other medieval weapon did: a lifetime of conditioning. A proper English warbow could have a draw weight of over 100 pounds. Some estimates for recovered longbows from the wreck of the Mary Rose suggest draw weights well beyond what most modern archers could pull today. Skeletal remains of medieval English archers show pronounced physical deformities, enlarged left arms, bone spurs on the shoulders and wrists, evidence of bodies literally reshaped by years of repetitive, punishing strain. You could not conjure that kind of archer for a single campaign. You had to grow them. And so, English kings did something almost unheard of. They legislated a national archery culture,
Edward III issued royal decrees ordering that on Sundays and holidays, Englishmen practice archery instead of useless games like football and cockfighting, sports that were, at various points, banned outright to keep men focused on the bow. Villages were required to maintain archery butts. Fathers trained sons. Practice wasn't a hobby. It was, in effect, mandatory reserve military service woven into the rhythm of ordinary life. By the mid-1300s, England had built something no other kingdom in Europe possessed: a deep, renewable population of cheap, devastatingly effective ranged infantry. Not mercenaries, not nobles. Farmers, tradesmen, and commoners. An army hiding inside the civilian population, waiting to be called up. This was the quiet revolution before the loud one. The battles were about to make it famous.
Crécy, the humbling. In 1346, English King Edward III invaded France, igniting what history would remember as the 100 Years' War. His army was outnumbered, exhausted, and far from home. The French army bearing down on him was everything a medieval war machine was supposed to be. Thousands of mounted knights, the flower of French nobility, backed by Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries considered among the finest professional soldiers in Europe. On paper, this was not a fair fight. It wasn't. Just not in the way anyone expected. Edward positioned his forces on a gentle slope near the village of Crécy. His archers, thousands of them, were ranged on the flanks, funneling any attacker into a killing field. Rain had soaked the battlefield earlier that day, and when the Genoese crossbowmen advanced, their bowstrings were damp and slack, robbing their weapons of range and power. The English longbowmen, who could simply unstring their bows to keep the cord dry, had no such problem. The Genoese loosed a volley that fell embarrassingly short. The English answer came back like a hailstorm. And
10 years later, in 1356, the lesson repeated itself almost exactly, and arguably even more humiliatingly for France. At Poitiers, Edward III's son, Edward the Black Prince, a name that would become legend, found his smaller army cornered by a French force roughly twice its size, commanded by King John II of France himself. It should have been a rout. Instead, the Black Prince used the terrain. Hedges, sunken lanes, and vineyards that broke up cavalry charges and funneled French knights directly into concentrated English arrow fire, exactly as his father had at Crécy. The result was catastrophic for France, not just militarily, but symbolically. King John II himself was captured on the field, along with a huge portion of the French nobility. The King of France, taken prisoner by an army built substantially around commoners with bows, was paraded through London, a public humiliation that echoed across every royal court in Europe. If Crécy was a shock, Poitiers was proof. This wasn't a fluke, it was a system. And the system kept winning.
Agincourt, the legend. 59 years later, France would be given one more chance to disprove the lesson. It would not go well for them either. In 1415, King Henry V invaded France with an army ravaged by dysentery, exhausted from a grueling march, and hopelessly outnumbered, by some estimates, facing a French force several times its size. Henry's men were cold, sick, and far from any hope of reinforcement. Everything about the situation screamed disaster. The battlefield at Agincourt was a narrow strip of muddy farmland, hemmed in by dense woodland on both sides, terrain that would prove to be Henry's greatest and perhaps only advantage. His longbowmen, protected by sharpened wooden stakes driven into the ground to break cavalry charges, packed the flanks. The French, confident in their overwhelming numbers, advanced across open, freshly plowed, rain-soaked ground. That ground became a trap. Heavy French cavalry and dismounted men-at-arms, weighed down by armor, sank into the mud with every step. As they struggled forward, funneled by the tree line into an ever-narrower killing zone, the English archers unleashed volley after volley into the packed, slow-moving mass.
Men fell, were trampled by.
Why it worked, and why it couldn't last. So why didn't the rest of Europe simply copy the longbow? This is one of history's great counterintuitive turns. The longbow wasn't secret technology. It was, on paper, dead simple. The barrier wasn't the weapon. It was the decades of physical conditioning required to use it effectively. Conditioning that could only be built through a sustained cultural and legal commitment most kingdoms weren't structured to make. France, with its deeply entrenched knightly aristocracy, had little interest in arming and training a peasant class capable of killing nobles from a distance. That was, in a very real sense, a threat to the entire social order, not just a tactical decision. England's peculiar circumstances, a smaller population, a tradition of free yeomanry, and kings willing to legislate archery into daily life created conditions almost impossible to replicate elsewhere. And yet, the very thing that made the longbow so devastating also sealed its eventual.
The Longbowman's story is, at its heart, a story about the collision between tradition and disruption, a lesson that echoes far beyond medieval battlefields. For 100 years, a weapon in the hands of common men shattered the assumption that birth and armor guaranteed dominance. It proved that a well-trained, well-organized force of ordinary people could topple the most privileged and heavily invested elite of its age, not through numbers alone, but through discipline, preparation, and a willingness to embrace a tool the establishment underestimated. The suits of armor in museums today, the ruins of castles, the romantic image of knighthood, all of it survives as spectacle. But it was the quiet, calloused, misshapen arms of English farmers and tradesmen who actually rewrote the rules of war. Their names are almost entirely lost to history. Their arrows were not. The age of the knight did not end in a single battle, but at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, it was shown again and again that it could be.
If this story of ordinary men who redrew the map of medieval Europe pulled you in, subscribe, because history is full of these hidden revolutions, moments where the underdog wasn't lucky, they were simply better prepared. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us next time as we uncover the next turning point that changed the course of history.